Two of the hostages killed in recent weeks by Islamic State were from Japan, a country not directly involved in combat. But Japan is a country that's poised to grow its defense budget. Japan's international role then may be changing. Joining us now for more in Washington, D.C., Shihoko Goto, Senior Northeast Asia Associate at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Welcome to the agenda.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. You know, many people around the world taken by surprise when those two Japanese citizens were beheaded, not only for the brutality and the sadness of all of that, but I think because a lot of people think the fight against ISIL is really a Western thing. What has been Japan's involvement in the Middle East?
Well, in a nutshell, it's economic interests. Japan and indeed much of East Asia is dependent very much on oil from the Middle East as well as natural gas. So there are a lot of investments from Japan in the Middle East that secure natural resources. But in this case, the two hostages were taken only hours after Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe announced aid to countries impacted by ISIL activities of the tune of $200 million. And so the hostages were taken, and a ransom payment of exactly $200 million was demanded for their release.
I want to talk about what the Prime Minister of Japan said. That happened on January 17th, and when he pledged those 200 million US bucks, he said it was to help build human capacities, infrastructure, and so on. So what exactly was the money that Japan promised to give supposed to do?
The money was supposed to help those who have been impacted by the activities of ISIL, so that if you became a refugee and you had to leave Syria and go to Lebanon or Jordan, that money was supposed to be used to help habituate them, get them the necessary medical supplies and food, and provide them with humanitarian aid. It was not something that was going to be used directly for attacking the ISIL forces.
And then, of course, ISIL then misinterpreted this or misused this and said, we'll give you your citizens back if you give us $200 million US.
Right. I mean, whether they misinterpreted or deliberately misread what the Japanese government was trying to do, it is clear that they saw it as a way that Japan was aligning itself with Western powers, including the United States. And so this was a way to really kind of put Japan in the same camp as the rest of the Western powers.
Okay, Shihoko, so we know, you know, the reaction around the world to these beheadings has been, you know, astonished and sad. Let's go through what's been happening on the ground in Japan itself. First of all, what was the public reaction there?
I think it was great horror. Bear in mind that the Middle East, for most Japanese, it's a very remote country. So we have been seeing a lot of these beheadings of Britons and French people and all sorts of nationalities, but we've not had any Asians in this kind of situation. So it was horror, denial, and then once there was talk about ransom payment or other conditions, prisoner exchange, there was a lot of high hope that there would be a release, that there would be a favorable outcome, that these two hostages, and certainly the second of the hostages to be released in some way, shape, or form. And when that was not to happen, there has been a lot of soul-searching in Japan about what it is that Japan wants to do, how Japan wants to engage in the Middle East, and more broadly, what Japan's role is in international peacekeeping or peace-preserving activities. And
as Japan goes through this soul-searching, we saw through in the case of the Jordanian pilot being killed by ISIL, that the Jordanian public, a lot of them criticized their government. Has there been that criticism brewing in Japan towards its own government?
Well, what the Japanese want to do, well, I should say, what the Prime Minister has been pressing for is for Japan to be able to play offense, that it can react to these kinds of situations. At the moment, Japan has what's called a pacifist constitution, which prevents its forces from being deployed outside its borders. Now, since last summer, there has been moves to for Japan to shed that constitutional limitation so that it can play offense as much as it can defense. And what it would like to do, what the government would like to do, is should a similar situation arise, there could be other options as opposed to simply trying to be at the mercy of the terrorists themselves or trying to negotiate with them through other countries, including the United States or European countries, so that Japan can actually deploy its own troops or actually send forces in and act on its own behalf.
Well, as you say, I mean, this is all enshrined in the Japanese Constitution just after the Second World War, Article 9. Just, I know you know this, but I just, for myself and the audience, I just want to read a little bit about what Article 9 says. So hear me out here. Okay, here's part of what it says. Aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. To accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized. Now, Shihoko, that's an article about 70 years old now. Until now, and we'll talk a little bit more about how things are changing, but how has that article and that pacifist nature of Japan, how has it sort of shaped Japan's defense thinking?
Well, Japan's defense strategy essentially depends heavily on a security alliance with the United States. So that should Japan come under attack from a foreign country, the United States, under this alliance, will intervene on its behalf. In return, Japan is not going to reciprocate. It's not going to come to the United States' defense if the United States comes under attack. But Japan provides a lot of military bases to U.S. forces. So that becomes the launching pad for the United States to be engaged, not just in Japan, but with the entire Asia-Pacific theater. So what Japan wants to do, or the government wants to do, is to have more ownership of its own security, to not be as dependent on this U.S.-Japan alliance. In Washington, certainly, there is a lot of welcoming voices to this because, let's face it, the United States is strapped for cash. Its military is stretched out. It has commitments not just in the Middle East, but also in Ukraine. It's still engaged in Afghanistan. It's got a lot of other places that it needs to be beholden to. And so any support that it can get from its allies, including Japan, is welcome. But for the Japanese public, this is a highly emotional issue. Remember that Japan has not had a war casualty since World War II. That is a huge achievement. It's been 70 years and no one's died on a battlefront. Any change to that constitution would quite possibly lead to a change in that equation. Are the Japanese prepared for that? A lot of public sentiment is very much against it. But we have to bear in mind that this idea about constitutional reform has come not just because of this ISIL situation, but because of the changing reality in East Asia. There is rising military threats across the region, most notably North Korea and its nuclear potential. And also China's military spending is gaining rapidly. Japan has territorial disputes with China. This is a very tense situation where the possibility of conflict is high. So the argument for Japan to be able to beef up its military resonates with a significant population.
I don't mean to pick on the Japanese public or Japanese culture. I take the point that there has been no direct boots on the ground military involvement, but Japan has been financially supporting its allies for years in war. I mean, isn't that involvement in itself?
Yes, it could be argued that it's an indirect way. It's pocketbook diplomacy, it's pocketbook military activism. But from a politician's point of view, you're not actually putting your own people at the first line of defense. So it is a little bit easier to justify. But there is a lot of frustration amongst those Japanese who feel that Japan should take more ownership of its own defense.
Okay. You talked a bit about this, but I want to pick it away at it a bit more. This is last year when the Prime Minister Abe, and he talked about sort of loosening the restrictions around Japan's involvement. And Article 9 was determined that it allows collective self-defense. Parse that for me. What does that mean?
It essentially means that if you are part of an alliance, so if the United States is engaged in some sort of activity and requires its partners to be engaged in military operations, then Japan would be engaged in it as well. And now there's two debates on this. The Prime Minister is more active about being supportive of Japan's allies and taking a more direct involvement in military affairs. Others would argue that that's all very good and well, collective self-defense, but that can only come if it comes as a United Nations sanctioned activity. Okay. So that would be like the two defining lines.
So that's the struggle that the government is dealing with right now, right. How this gets to be defined.
Right.
Okay, so the fight against ISIL might qualify, it may not, depending on how the government decides to proceed forward.
Exactly. There is a debate right now. There are a number of security-related bills that are being debated in the Diet, which is the Japanese parliament. And we are still looking at how this will pan out. And certainly what's been happening in the Middle East is really of interest to a lot of politicians who may be uncertain as to what Japan should do next.
And you talked about China, and I want to talk about China and Japan's other neighbors. How has the introduction of this collective self-defense been received by Japan's neighbors?
China and South Korea have been very apprehensive about it. They see this as a move to militarism, that Japan is getting closer and closer to a kind of wanting to become a military power once again. The government's argument would be that Japan is actually an abnormal country right now, that there really are no countries that have such a stringent pacifist constitution, and that any change to that would only make Japan a normal country. But the relation between Japan and Korea, Japan and China, are so bitter at the moment over the legacy of World War II, about Japan's colonialist past in these two countries. And it's a very sensitive issue, which really becomes an emotional one as much as a practical security issue.
And you raise the concerns that the opposition parties have about this change in tone. Do you share those concerns?
Do I share the concerns about aggressive militarism by Japan? To some extent, yes. But I also am very well aware that Washington has a lot of constraints, budgetary constraints, and the political will for the United States to intervene on the behalf of the Japanese government may not necessarily be as stringent as the Japanese would want. So I personally think that constitutional reform, revision, I should say, is called constitutional reinterpretation. So Article 9, the wording of Article 9 would not change. So it's the interpretation of those words that would change. And I think it is time for Japan to actually reinterpret its words. And I say that because Japan wants to play a bigger role in the international community, and it has done so over the decades by really paying for a lot of things, paying for UN peacekeeping operations, paying for infrastructure development. But I do think there comes a time, too, where it actually needs to put people as well as money.
What would that role look like?
Well, on a practical matter, the Japanese military recruitment might be very difficult. Unlike in the United States, the allure of a military career is not very high in Japan. The prospect of dying on a battlefield may actually turn even more people off. But on the other hand, there may be a way to increase the prestige and the power of the military, which would make it a very attractive career, and it could actually end up attracting the best and brightest that Japan has to offer.
We will see what decisions this country makes moving forward. Shihoko Goto, thank you very much for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.